Chapter 1. The world was a mausoleum draped in endless, unforgiving winter. Elias stood at the skeletal window of Blackwood Manor, his reflection a pale, elegant blur against the obsidian glass. Outside, the last sliver of a gibbous moon, indifferent and ancient, cast a metallic, spectral light upon the grounds. This isolation, this perpetual twilight, was both his self-imposed prison and his necessary shield. He had not truly lived in centuries. He had merely anchored himself to this lonely precipice, a monument to a guilt older than the forests that clawed at the manor walls. His stillness was not of repose, but of a taut, self-inflicted discipline. He was the Kaelin, the last of his line, a vampire king whose power was a corrosive burden, and whose sole remaining act of grace was to keep the world from the monsters that were his kin, and from the monster that he knew himself to be. The silence of the manor was a heavy velvet shroud, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire in the vast Gothic hearth. Loneliness was the thematic word of his existence, a cold language spoken by the dust motes dancing in the meager light. He repeated the ancient vow in a soundless internal echo, an oath sworn on the ashes of those he failed. Protect the line, protect the secret. A shadow, not his own, moved near the periphery of his vision, breaking the perfect, deathly symmetry of the hall. It was his son, Gabriel. Elias did not turn. He did not need to. Gabriel's presence was a signature in the air, a faint metallic scent of young blood carefully kept, and the crushing weight of unspoken sorrow. Gabriel, the boy who did not speak. Gabriel, the legacy of a moment of brutal, terrifying hope, born mute by a fever that should have ended his frail life a decade ago. Mute and possessed of eyes that saw too much, eyes that shimmered with an unsettling, otherworldly gold whenever the shadows deepened. Elias had learned to communicate with him through the old, formal signs of the court, a silent ballet of hands that spoke volumes of history and pain. Gabriel walked with a liquid grace, a terrible stillness inherited from his father, yet lacked the hardened marble of a true vampire. He was a creature suspended between two worlds, a fragile, exquisite glass artifact in a realm of stone and storm. Gabriel stopped a respectful distance away, his small hands moving in a precise, practiced sequence. Gabriel, Father. The cold deepens, the wards are taut, but there is a fracture near the west gate, a new sound in the ether. Elias finally turned, his movement a slow, inhuman slide. His features were sculpted from moonstone, impossibly perfect and utterly devoid of warmth. His gaze, an overwhelming ancient silver, rested upon the boy. He felt the familiar, fierce contraction in his chest, a protective instinct that felt like a flaw in his otherwise flawless coldness. It is not the cold you feel, mio cuore. It is the growing pressure of the Covenant's impatience. Elias's voice was a low, formal baritone, like velvet draped over granite, resonant yet strangely intimate in the echoing space. They sense the shift. They sense the vulnerability in the bloodline. Tell me of this new sound. Be precise. Gabriel's hands articulated a complex idea, a blend of the court signs and his own spontaneous visual metaphor. Gabriel, it is not a siege bell, Father. It is a whisper, a singular note, high and insistent, like a lone anchor dropped into an endless black sea. It draws the shadows to it, but does not yield to them. It is human, a singular human, here, in the forgotten, magically sealed heart of the ancient forest, miles from any settlement. Elias's mind, a complex engine of strategic calculation and accumulated trauma, dismissed the possibility instantly, then violently rerouted. It could not be. Not after the cost, not after the final, devastating prophecy was sealed. He stepped closer to his son, his breath a non-existent thing. his scent of ash and aged parchment momentarily overwhelming the room. He placed a single, impossibly cold finger beneath Gabriel's chin, tilting the boy's face to the spectral light. Do not let your powerful mercy invent fictions, Gabriel. The human world ended its connection to ours long ago. Wards do not fracture for a simple, wandering mortal. This is a lure, a trap laid by the Strigoi, or the remnants of the old empire. You will not leave the manor's wards. You will not engage. This is an order. Gabriel held his father's terrifying gaze, his own golden eyes unflinching. His hands moved again, slower this time, less descriptive, more of a fierce, intimate declaration. Gabriel, I have already felt its touch. It is in pain. It is near the gate. I feel its choice, Father, and it is survival. Elias closed his eyes, a flicker of true, raw emotion crossing his marble features, self-hatred for the life he had brought forth, and a terrifying, desperate love for the boy who insisted on possessing a conscience. He knew that new sound was the signal. It was the catalyst. He had spent centuries waiting for the knife to fall, and now it was here, disguised not as a warrior, but as a plea. The manor suddenly felt less like a haven and more like a cage waiting to be sprung open. The high-stakes game had just begun, the pieces moved by an unseen hand in the lonely darkness. Elias vowed he would be the one to pay the price, not his son. Chapter 2. The forest air was a brutal, physical force, a dense, palpable sheet of frozen moisture and the ancient, earthy smell of dying cedar. Outside the compromised perimeter of Blackwood Manor, near the fractured western gate, a solitary figure lay collapsed amongst the root-tangled snow. Her name was Lyra, a name of music now choked by ash. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, misting violently in the sub-zero air. She was a scholar, a specialist in forgotten oaths and the occult cartography of the lost world, now reduced to a fugitive, driven by sheer, blinding conviction. Her clothes, once the formal, heavy wool of a dark academia uniform, were now torn and blood-stained, offering little resistance to the cold that seeped into her very bones. Lyra had walked for 3 days through the treacherous, magical wilderness, fleeing the discovery of her nature. She was one of the Anchor, a rare, prophesied human born with the terrifying ability to not only perceive the ancient magic, but to actively solidify and bind it. The Covenant, a shadow government of lesser vampires and power-hungry mortals, had hunted her line for centuries, seeking to forge her power into a weapon capable of dominating the dwindling remnants of the great houses. She carried nothing but a heavy, leather-bound journal filled with cryptic formalized notes on the Vampire King's lineage and an antique silver locket that held no image, only the scent of dried lilies. As the cold intensified, pulling her toward a seductive final oblivion, the pressure behind her eyes began to mount. It was the magic of the manor itself, a dense, cold wall of ancient protection that was paradoxically the only thing keeping her alive. It pulsed, a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat against the confines of her skull. She knew the truth that the world had forgotten. The Kaelin, the king of the vampires, was not merely a tyrant of blood, but the keeper of the most powerful, oldest covenant, the oath that kept the true, destructive demons of the outer dark from spilling into the human world. He was the necessary evil, and she, the Anchor, needed to reach him to seal a new, more terrible contract. With a superhuman effort born of desperation, not strength, Lyra pushed herself onto her knees. Her movement was jarring and raw, a stark contrast to the liquid stillness of the manor's inhabitants. She could see the west gate now, massive wrought iron, covered in elegant frozen spikes and etched with the protective wards of an ancient formalized language. One of the iron bars, thicker than a man's torso, had been mysteriously twisted.
a raw, screaming wound in the otherwise perfect defense. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and placed her palm directly onto the frozen metal. The physical contact was an immediate, blinding shock. The ward's protective energy, a language of cold, burning silver light, did not repel her. Instead, it responded. It resonated with her, settling into the core of her being like a missing piece of a terrible puzzle. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot spear of power running up her arm, yet she bit down on a cry, refusing to yield the sound to the merciless wind. This was the moment of her choice, the declaration of intent Gabriel had sensed. She was not a victim seeking shelter. She was a catalyst. Suddenly, the scent hit her, overwhelming the cold and the dust, a complex, intoxicating blend of blood, ash, and expensive, aged incense. It was the signature of an apex predator. The snow nearby did not crunch. It simply yielded.
Beneath a heavy, silent presence, Lyra did not need to look up. She felt the gaze, cold, ancient, and utterly merciless, boring into the nape of her neck. You are not a warrior, yet you have breached a centuries-old protection with a touch. The voice came, a low, formal drone of authority, close enough to send a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The penalty for trespass is severance. Tell me your name, human, before I grant you the mercy of a quick end. Lyra slowly pushed herself up, turning to face the figure. The moonlight caught the sharp, almost painful beauty of Elias, the vampire king. He looked like a statue carved from perfect, cold marble, draped in severe, dark velvets, his silver eyes filled with a weary, terrible knowledge. She had studied him in texts for years, yet the sheer, immediate force of his power was paralyzing. She refused to lower her gaze. "My name is Lyra," she rasped, the words scraped from her dry throat, "and I have not trespassed. I have answered the covenant." She forced her trembling hand to unclench, revealing the silver locket. "I am the anchor, and I have come to tell you, Kaelin, that your oath is failing. You must choose to kill me or save us both." Chapter 3. The stillness that followed Lyra's declaration was deeper and more terrifying than the silence of the storm. Elias felt a profound, seismic shift in the air, a spiritual vertigo that had not touched him since the fall of the Old Kingdom. He was accustomed to the language of fear, of supplication, of aggressive defiance, never the language of suicidal, fierce conviction from a creature so fragile. Lyra, standing there, shivering and bleeding, yet holding his ancient gaze with a desperate, prophetic intensity, was a challenge that defied his strategic mind. Her scent, human, clean, yet overlaid with the sharp, burning ozone of active, high-level magic, was a dangerous lure to his nature, a siren call to the beast he kept perpetually leashed. "The covenant is the shadow, human. I am the seal," Elias stated, his voice dropping another degree, an icy promise. His hands remained steady at his sides, but his control was a taut, invisible wire. "Prophecies are dust. The only truth is my power, and my power requires your immediate cessation. The anchor died 200 years ago, in the purge of the Sanguine cult. Do not waste my mercy with fictions." He moved one slow, deliberate step closer, closing the distance to an intimate, fatal measure. He intended to paralyze her with proximity, to break her will and end the interaction before the boy, his son, could be drawn further into this dangerous, destabilizing event. Lyra did not flinch. She was hyper-aware of his every inhuman attribute, the absolute lack of breath, the crystalline perfection of his skin, the impossible speed that he held in check. But the overwhelming melancholy in his silver eyes, the weary burden, struck a deeper chord than his menace. She knew his story, the weight of the collective guilt of his species resting on his ancient shoulders. She died because she gave her blood to seal the original oath, an act of brutal, beautiful sacrifice. Lyra whispered, her tone shifting from formal defiance to quiet, agonizing intimacy. But the power is in the line, not the individual. The blood is the vessel, but the choice is the engine. And I have chosen. You feel the magic I carry. It is the truth of your own forgotten law. She held up the silver locket again, this time turning it so the moonlight caught a tiny, almost imperceptible inscription in the metal. Fiat luxage in tenebris. Let there be light in the darkness. It was the motto of the original covenant, lost to the histories of all but the most dedicated scholars and the Kaelin himself. The inscription was a physical strike. Elias froze. The motto was a word he had not seen or heard spoken in 500 years. It was the language of his original, self-hating oath. It was the secret code of the prophecy he had tried to bury beneath centuries of isolated indifference. His strategic calculus dissolved into a primal knot of confusion and rage. Impossible, he breathed, the word a soundless movement of his sculpted lips. Suddenly, a small, cold hand slipped into his own, a feather-light but utterly commanding pressure. Gabriel had breached the inner perimeter. He stood at his father's side, his golden eyes fixed not on the human, but on the strange, shimmering light that was now emanating from Lyra's wound, a raw, protective glow that was simultaneously drawing the darkness and repelling it. Gabriel's hands began to move, a frantic, highly descriptive language of warning and insistence. Gabriel, Father, she is the one, not the warrior of blood, but the anchor of bone and spirit. The whisper is growing into a song. If you kill her, you break the seal. The world ends not with a siege, but with a dissolution. The covenant has sought the vessel, not the weapon. She is the key. Elias felt the crushing weight of his son's certainty, the sheer, devastating conviction in the boy's otherworldly gaze. Gabriel did not lie, and his perception of the spiritual world was unnervingly absolute. The philosophical conflict, mercy versus nature, oath versus survival, clashed violently within the king. To kill her was to preserve his solitude and his self-control, but to risk the utter destruction of the world he was sworn to protect. To save her was to introduce a wild, dangerous human element into the heart of his sanctuary, to risk the life of his son, and to condemn himself to a terrifying, high-stakes vulnerability he had spent a millennium avoiding. He looked from the child's fierce, hopeful eyes to the woman's defiant, pain-etched face. The choice was not survival, it was trust, an alien concept to a creature of his age and power. With a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 years, Elias made his final, terrifying decision. He did not ask. He commanded. "You will walk inside the manor's protection, Lyra," he said, his voice now a low growl, a promise of both shelter and absolute scrutiny. "You will be watched, contained, and you will speak only the truth. If you prove to be a lure, I will not grant you severance. I will grant you remembrance, and it will be eternal." He turned, his vast, dark cloak sweeping across the snow, beckoning them both into the terrifying security of Blackwood Manor. "Gabriel, you will attend to the wards. Then you will bring me a report on the history of the Anchor's bloodline. Everything." Chapter 4. The interior of Blackwood Manor was a study in theatrical, oppressive luxury, a perfect expression of Gothic fantasy and dark academia aesthetic. Towering ceilings disappeared into shadow, lit only by the sporadic, high-flung glow of a few centuries-old candles set in silver candelabras. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather, cold marble, and the faint, persistent smell of burning cedar from the vast roaring fire in the main drawing room. Lyra, guided by a silent, watchful servant, a rare, ancient vampire whose stillness rivaled the king's, was led through halls lined with intimidatingly tall, dark bookshelves housing countless volumes bound in obscure, formalized languages and human skin. Each step on the polished, geometric stone floor felt like a violation of the deep, self-imposed quiet of the place. The servant deposited her in a severe yet strangely beautiful guest room. It was furnished only with a heavy, four-poster bed draped in deep green velvet, a dark oak writing desk, and a single floor-to-ceiling window overlooking a garden swallowed by the winter. The king is bound by his own law. You are safe from immediate harm, for now. The servant, a woman named Celine with eyes the color of polished jade, stated formally. Her voice was thin, like the scraping of silk. You are expected to rest. Do not touch the books. Do not leave the room. Should you require sustenance, you will state it. Should you attempt to deceive or flee, the penalties have already been outlined. Celine did not wait for a reply, vanishing from the doorway with a speed that made her departure appear like a trick of the candlelight. Lyra sank onto the edge of the bed, the sheer tension of the past 72 hours finally catching up to her. Her mind, a whirlwind of scholarly notes and desperate convictions, struggled to process the intimate, devastating proximity to the creature she had only known through fragmented, ancient texts. She was here, in the heart of the beast's lair, yet she felt a paradoxical sense of quiet hope. She had crossed the Rubicon. She was the catalyst, the spark in the ash. Her focus was drawn to the desk, where a heavy, bound folio was deliberately placed. It was a primary source, a history of the Kalen lineage, written in a formalized, poetic hand. Her scholarly curiosity warred with her exhaustion. She chose conviction. Meanwhile, in the King's private library, a sanctuary of formalized knowledge, Elias stood before a map that was older than most nations, charting the metaphysical boundaries of the world. Gabriel sat nearby, utterly absorbed in a complex array of ancient, wax-sealed scrolls he had retrieved from the manor's archives. The boy's intense focus, his quiet determination, was the only thing that kept Elias tethered to his strategic mind. Elias watched him, the ever-present, fiercely protective love a burning counterpoint to his own cold discipline. The blood of the anchor's lineage possesses a terrifying power, Elias began, his voice low, a pedagogical tone mixed with self-recrimination. It is not the power to attack or defend, but the power of absolute intention, the ability to turn spiritual metaphor into physical law, to give the ancient oaths solid form. It is why we were sworn to protect them, and why the covenant will destroy the world to possess them. Gabriel looked up, his face etched with understanding. His hands moved quickly. Gabriel, but Father, the original texts speak of a duality, that the anchor is only half of the seal. It requires the Sorrow King to complete the binding, the one whose guilt defines his shield. Elias closed his eyes, the words Sorrow King, his epithet among the few who knew the true history, a brutal, concise summary of his existence. That is the prophecy I buried, he admitted, his formal language cracking with raw truth. The one that drove me to isolate us here, the one that demands a sacrifice I am not willing to make. The king must provide the vessel, the blood and the will, and the anchor provides the lock. The complete oath requires the death of the anchor, sealed by the king's own hand. Gabriel stood, crossing the distance between them, his movement purposeful. He placed his small, cold hand on his father's arm. His signs became intimate, intense, a high-value declaration of character. Gabriel, she spoke of choice, Father. The texts also speak of choice. The anchor has the power to redefine the oath, not merely repeat it. She is an engine of survival, not a tool of sacrifice. You must trust her conviction. It is the only way to save us from the covenant. The atmosphere in the library became heavy with the weight of the ancient dilemma. Elias knew his son was right. The boy's innate mercy was not a weakness, but a pure, untainted reflection of the power he had tried to harness and repress. Elias looked down at the hand on his arm, the gesture a stark contrast to his own self-hatred. He felt the shift, the reluctant yielding of centuries of self-imposed discipline to a raw, necessary hope. He would face this threat not as the lonely king, but as the protector of his son, and now the reluctant, desperate ally of a dangerous human scholar. The dramatic, high-stakes collision of guilt and hope was now inevitable. He had to meet her. He had to confirm her truth. Chapter 5. Lyra was not sleeping. She was sitting upright, tracing the intricate skeletal patterns of the winter branches against the glass of the large window, using the rhythmic motion to steady her ragged breathing. Her mind was a torrent of data: the manor's wards, the strange echoing silence, the raw, contained power of the king. She was an academic who had been thrown into the middle of her own research paper, and the sheer, intense energy was addictive. She needed to speak to Elias, to lay out the full scale of the Covenant's plan before her brief window of safety closed. The door opened without a sound, and Elias entered the room. His presence immediately sucked the air out of the space, turning the atmosphere tense and electric. He did not approach the bed, remaining near the dark oak desk, observing her with that frightening, silver-eyed intensity. He moved not like a man, but like liquid shadow coalescing into perfect form. He was dressed even more formally than before, in a long, severe coat that gave him the look of an executioner or a priest of a forgotten dark religion. "You have been contained for 4 hours," he said, his voice a low, formal judgment. "You have not attempted to escape, nor have you succumbed to the cold or fear. You have chosen defiance over rest. This is not the behavior of a simple, frightened human fugitive, Lyra. It is the behavior of a zealot. Speak, and for every truth, I will grant you 1 minute of continued existence." Lyra rose and walked toward him, stopping at a respectful but determined distance. She maintained eye contact, a declaration of intent that cut through the formalized hierarchy. "I am not defying you, Kaelin," she stated, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with the conviction that had driven her across the wilderness. "I am honoring the necessity of our collision. The Covenant is not seeking the anchor to simply bind your magic. They are seeking to transfer the entire oath, to shift the burden of keeping the outer dark at bay from your line to theirs, through a corrupted ritual powered by my blood. They want your freedom, not your death." Elias frowned, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that spoke volumes of his ancient shock. "My freedom is a myth," he stated coldly. "It is the curse I willingly bear. A transfer of the oath would require the complete mutual consent of both the king and the anchor. I would never agree to such an act. It would condemn the world." "Precisely," Lyra countered, taking a single, bold step closer. Her breath caught in her throat. The scent of him, blood and ash and terrible age, was suddenly overwhelming. "Which is why they are seeking your vessel, your son. Gabriel is the untainted lineage, the perfect conduit of your power, and the emotional anchor you cannot deny. They will use my death to lure you into the Covenant's heart, and then use the Sanguine cult's black ritual to force the oath upon Gabriel's blood, sealing it with your forced consent, the ultimate, inescapable sacrifice." The sheer, terrifying logic of her statement hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The philosophical dialogue had devolved into a brutal, character-driven political thriller. It spoke to his deepest trauma, his greatest shame, the failure to protect his line. He felt the cold, protective shield of his discipline begin to crack. The truth was not just in her words, it was in the powerful, burning light of her presence, the way she made the very air around her feel heavy with potential. Elias reacted not with violence, but with a terrifying, contained intensity. He moved with impossible speed, his hand snaking out to cup her face, his thumb resting gently, yet with immense pressure, against her jugular. It was a gesture of intimate, high-stakes threat. His silver eyes were now alight with a cold, terrifying fire. You speak with the authority of the ancient texts. How do you know of the sanguine cult's ritual? It was erased from all records, destroyed by my own hand, sealed with the blood of the previous anchor. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held her ground. She knew this was the final, devastating test of trust. I have the last pieces of the puzzle, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The original anchor, before her death, prepared a counter-oath. It is not one of sacrifice, but one of binding, a symbiotic contract. The king does not kill the anchor to seal the old oath. The king binds the anchor to the lineage to seal the new one. The power of the choice is mine. I choose to be your permanent, living shield, a declaration of trust, not a condemnation. Elias's stillness was absolute. He stared into her eyes, searching for the slightest flicker of deceit, of self-serving malice. He found only the blinding light of a powerful, necessary conviction and a terrifying, desperate vulnerability. He released her face, his hand withdrawing as swiftly as it had descended. His choice was made, his vulnerability exposed. You speak a dangerous, hopeful language, Lyra, he said, stepping back, the distance between them now a palpable entity. But my son trusts your conviction. I will honor his judgment. You will be my advisor. You will be my shield. But you will never leave this manor's protection. We are now allies in a siege of our own making. Chapter 6. The alliance formed between the ancient, guilt-burdened vampire king and the determined, prophetic human was a study in tense, formalized cooperation. The subsequent days were a deliberately rhythmic cycle of slow-burn intensity. Lyra worked in the library, side by side with Gabriel, poring over the fragile antique scrolls, her movements and whispered findings translating into the boy's rapid, highly descriptive sign language, which was then formally relayed to Elias. The language was sparse and purposeful, focusing on the Ethel, the ancient language of the oaths, the Nexus, the location of the required ritual, and the Strigoi, the leading faction of the Covenant. Elias was a constant, unsettling presence. He moved through the manor like a living metaphor of its architecture, cold, precise, and infinitely enduring. He never allowed himself to be alone with Lyra for long, but his gaze was always upon her, a formal, intense scrutiny that spoke volumes of his internal conflict. He was testing her conviction, searching for the moment of betrayal or weakness, yet simultaneously relying on her insight to survive. The air between them was a thick, charged atmosphere of high-stakes intimacy, driven by the shared, terrifying knowledge of their intertwined destinies. One frigid afternoon, while tracing a complex geometric pattern on the king's enormous, archaic globe, Lyra found the key. It was a marginal note, written in a hand that was impossibly small, a formalized observation made by the original anchor. The new oath must be witnessed by the blood of the lineage. It requires a declaration of pure, unadulterated intent. Gabriel saw her discovery first. He looked at the inscription, then at Lyra, his face alight with a quiet, fierce understanding. His hands moved with an almost ceremonial grace. Gabriel, Father needs an anchor for his choice, Lyra, not just for the law, an anchor for his heart. At that moment, Elias entered the room, drawn by the sudden shift in the spiritual atmosphere. He saw the shared look between the two figures, the human scholar and his silent, powerful son, a look of profound, terrifying trust. It was a vulnerability he had not accounted for in his strategic modeling. "What have you found?" Elias commanded, his tone formal, yet bearing an undertone of desperate urgency. Lyra looked up, her heart aching with the melancholy of his endless burden. She walked to the center of the room, her conviction burning brighter than the candlelight. The ritual requires a single, final act of intimate vulnerability, Kaelin. The Covenant has been planning a siege of stone and shadow. we must perform a siege of trust. The new oath is not sealed by the king's consent for the anchor's death, but by the king's declaration to protect the anchor's life above his own, a transfer of that unbearable guilt from your heart to your purpose. Elias stared at her, his flawless marble features etched with shock. The concept was alien to his centuries of solitary, self-hating discipline. "And what does this declaration require of the anchor?" he asked, the silence in the room pressing down on them all. "It requires the anchor to accept the transfer," Lyra replied, her voice soft, yet containing the weight of ancient power. She slowly raised her hands, a mirror of Gabriel's own silent language, and offered them to the king. The movement was a visual cue of immense vulnerability and a high-stakes declaration of trust. "It requires you to hold my hand, Kaelin, to feel the purity of my intention, to choose a path driven by hope, not merely survival, to anchor your guilt not to the dead, but to the living." Elias stood motionless, his control faltering. He saw the skeletal branches outside the window, the cold indifference of the moon, and the fierce, burning hope in the eyes of the woman who held his fate. The choice was not strategic. It was profoundly personal. He walked to her, his movement slow, deliberate, and terribly human. He looked at the two small, offered hands, then up at his son, who stood silently, watching, his golden eyes filled with quiet hope. Elias took the final, devastating risk. He reached out and took Lyra's hands in his own, marble cold meeting warm, electric vitality. The touch was an immediate, blinding shock of energy, a surge of magic that solidified the air, sealing the intimate, terrible pact. The covenant was answered. The game was won. The high-stakes survival had just begun.